just for fun, I thought that I might narrate my very own, true ghost story. Now this all actually happened. No word of a lie. This is an account of something that actually happened to me, and all I can say is that it made a believer out of me in the fact that there is a life beyond our own, and there are worlds as yet unknown to science. I have every confidence that they will be in due course, but perhaps we as a race aren't quite ready for that yet. But I have no doubt it's coming. Anyway, I digress. The year is 1997, and my mother, I'm sorry to say, was rather ill in hospital, and I had been going in to visit her every evening. I was working in the daytime and doing my City and Guilds in motor vehicle engineering at night at college. But after I had finished at college at about 8 o'clock at night, I would go in and visit her. And she, bless her, could begin to tell that I was growing tired. It was a punishing schedule, painting and decorating in the daytime, and then college in the evenings, and then sitting by her bedside for a couple of hours every night until they threw me out, and then home on my Lambretta for dinner. And it was getting towards the summer of 1997, and my mother said to me, she said, "Dilip, why don't you take a little break? Your college is about to break up for the summer holidays, and you've got time on your hands, and why not take a little holiday?" And my girlfriend at the time, Ginny, thought that was an excellent idea. She could see that I had been burning the candle at both ends and pushing myself somewhat. So we decided to have a little break for a week or so down in Dorset, which is a lovely, green, lush county of southern England with beautiful cliffside walks, picturesque little seaside towns, and a lot of history. There's a little railway that runs from the seaside town of Swanage out to the ruins of Corfe Castle, and it's a steam railway, a fully restored 1920s or 30s steam railway in absolutely beautiful condition, all the original carriages, wooden benches and all. And we went down there, we found a place to stay, and we rode the steam railway out to Corfe Castle, which is beautiful, a medieval castle that was, as the term is, slighted by Oliver Cromwell. That is, the towers and some of the ramparts were demolished with explosives at the end of the English Civil War because it had proved too tough a nut to crack. But all very picturesque, a beautiful county. But Dorset held one other fascination for me, which was that it was the location of Bovingdon Camp. It was the location of the last house occupied by T.E. Lawrence, a beautiful little cottage called Clouds Hill, and it was the place where T.E. Lawrence died. Now, I should explain, at the time I was reading my way through pretty much everything that T.E. Lawrence had ever written. He is, of course, the famous Lawrence of Arabia, a man of letters and a man of action, both. A man who was significant for his military achievements as he was for his literary achievements. His best-known book being, of course, 7 Pillars of Wisdom, which details his part in the war against the Turks in the Middle East, in what was then known as Arabia, during World War One, and his quite extraordinary achievements in which he practically invented special forces warfare. All that is by the by. At the end of World War One, he didn't want any fame and glory. The nation was eager to make him into a hero, and he really didn't want that. It was nothing to do with what he was about. He hated the public eye. He hated attention, despite being an extraordinarily adventurous soul. He did it for the joy of it, as far as I can see, and for the challenge, and to learn about himself. He was that kind of man. Hardly a typical British Army officer at all. Career interested him not one whit, and progression into the upper echelons of the army interested him not one whit. He had, prior to World War One, been a student of medieval history. He had conducted archaeological expeditions in the Middle East, looking for remains of the Crusades, and he was, I think, above all, a romantic, little interested in the hard progressions of this world, and more interested in his own personal journey and his own imaginings. And as such, through his writings, I always identified with him tremendously. Anyway, I made it my business, while we were down in Dorset, to visit all the sites of his life. I should explain, sorry, I digressed a little there. After the war, as I say, Lawrence had no interest in being promoted up through the ranks of the army. Instead, he chose to disappear, and he attempted to rejoin the army under an assumed name as an ordinary private. And for a little while this was successful, until the press discovered his whereabouts, and he was outed and effectively forced to, well, he was kicked out of the army as a private because he had joined under false pretenses. And being Lawrence, he disappeared again after that. He didn't court the press, although they would have loved to have known what he was thinking or what was going on with him. He had no interest in any of that. He disappeared again. And from what I've been able to ascertain, he was essentially homeless for a while, drifting around the streets, but he was physically, despite his small stature, he was physically a very resilient man. And if you can survive in the Negev desert, then you can certainly survive on the streets of London. And he did. And after a little interval, he decided to join another service. So he joined the RAF as an ordinary aircraftman. And his experiences of going into the RAF just as an ordinary enlisted man are detailed in his book, The Mint. You have to remember, this is an Oxford University graduate, an extremely experienced archaeologist, historian, and an extremely experienced soldier, joining the RAF as your basic Irk, a new recruit, and not as a flyer, as somebody who is destined to be trained, if they're lucky, to work repairing aircraft. So he joins up. He makes something of a career in the RAF, and all the while he is writing. And thanks to the kindness of his literary friends, because he certainly wouldn't have been able to afford it on an aircraftsman's wage, he is able to buy a cottage near the military camp where he was stationed. And not only is he able to buy this cottage, Clouds Hill, he is also able to indulge his other passion, largely due to the thanks, as I say, of the kindness, as I say, of benefactors, literary benefactors, people like George Bernard Shaw, who understood the value of Lawrence's literary works, most of which were as yet unpublished, but he was writing all the time. And he was able to buy a motorbike, and not just any motorbike. He was able, thanks largely to George Bernard Shaw's generosity, to buy a Brough Superior SS100. I believe he owned an SS80 first and then the SS100. This was an extraordinary motorcycle by any measure. George Brough had designed it to use the finest components, castle forks, and you name it, the very best components of the time. It had a beautiful nickel-plated fuel tank, but still very much a 1920s, 30s motorcycle with a hand gear change and an oil system that relied on regular pumping from the rider. In other words, there was a pump mounted on the side of the tank and you had to give it a few shots every now and again. In the book The Mint, there is a chapter called The Road, in which Lawrence writes very eloquently about his love for his motorcycle and his joy in riding it. And he was a man with absolutely no concept of danger, or rather he had a concept of danger. He was just damned if he was going to let it worry him. So he rode around the lanes of Dorset. His great release from the regimented life of a recruit in the RAF was to go out on his motorbike, frequently at night, and ride a couple of 100 miles before returning to camp before dawn. And you have to remember that the roads of England at this stage the country roads, were frequently unmade, rough, varying in surface. There might be tarmac stretches, and they may suddenly turn to dirt roads. And Lawrence would fly down these at the 100 mile per hour plus speeds of which the Brough Superior was capable. It was a 1000cc V-twin with an engine made by JAP, Prestwich's, a superb engine, immensely powerful for its time. And the inevitable happened. One beautiful afternoon, shortly after he had actually left the RAF, this was in, I think, 1935, he was out for one of his regular joyrides on the Brough, and he came over the crest of a hill, throttle wide open, 100 miles an hour plus. He used to race aircraft from the local aerodrome, for heaven's sake. They all knew him because he was an RAF man. So when they spotted his bike on a road, they would dip down to treetop level, give him a wave, what Lawrence called the Randy RAF up ya gesture, and they would put their ears back and go for it. And Lawrence would sometimes beat these Bristol fighters, airplanes, remember, down the country roads, because they could top out at 110 or so, 115, and he could top out at 120, 130. So, yeah, the man rode fast. He really did. And, as I say, the inevitable happened. He was coming over a crest one day, I have absolutely no doubt going way too fast, as was his wont, and two errand boys on bicycles, delivery boys, effectively, were coming over the crest of the hill in the opposite direction, one of them on the wrong side of the road. They were kids, you know. Rather than hit them, Lawrence swerved and launched his motorcycle, probably at 100 miles an hour plus, through a hedge. He sustained severe head injuries, and he died in the infirmary at Bovingdon Camp, the nearest military camp, which is now a museum. Some days later, I think it was anything up to about a week. He was a strong man. It took him a while to die, but the head injuries were fatal. Bless him. Anyway, when I was visiting Dorset in 1997, as I say, I made it my business to visit the various sites of Lawrence's life down there. So we went to Clouds Hill one afternoon, his cottage, which is an extraordinary place. He had no heating in there, but he had it all lined in aluminium sheet, which I would imagine working on an RAF base was easy to come by. And his theory being that this would keep the heat in and the house would effectively self-heat. That's just one example of the eccentricity. In the living room, there was no furniture save a great, huge, large, upholstered, square piece of furniture. I don't know how you'd describe it, a bed or a divan or something. It was certainly the size of a king-size double bed, but upholstered in leather. And the idea was that he and his friends could simply lounge on it. Needless to say, the living room was lined with shelves, and the National Trust, who now run the place, had done a superb job of stocking the shelves with books that were actually for sale, that were relevant to Lawrence and his period in history. And I'm very pleased to say I bought a copy, a first edition, of his book The Mint, about his time in the RAF, off the shelf in the man's own living room. It was expensive, but you don't count the cost at moments like that. Beautiful book, and I still have it to this day, and I'm very pleased and proud that I have it. Published in his own lifetime, and books of Lawrence published in his own lifetime are quite rare. So, anyway, after that, I decided to go and visit the churchyard where Lawrence was buried, which was quite nearby, again in Dorset. He has a bust, a statue, in St Paul's Cathedral in Poets' Corner because of his literary achievements, but where he is actually buried is in a small churchyard of a tiny Norman church in Dorset. So we went there, and I went and stood wrapped in contemplation at his graveside for a while, just paying my respects to somebody whom I found a literary inspiration and an inspiration in terms of, I suppose, achievement and endurance and stoicism, qualities that Lawrence had in abundance and that have inspired me. And having done that, I then said to Ginny, okay, let's get in the car and head back to our hotel. Which we did. We got in her little grey Nissan Micra. She was driving, and we drove back. It was by now dusk, so we drove back through these dappled woodland lanes of Dorset. It's gently rolling countryside, farmland on either side of these little narrow lanes, trees dappling the road with the lowering sunlight of dusk. There is nothing more beautiful. The sights, the sounds, the smells, and it is very much the England that I know and love. So there we were, driving down this beautiful country lane, flitting in and out of the dappled, lowering sunlight. And suddenly we hear, coming up behind us, fast, a large motorcycle, a large and loud motorcycle. And it is flying up behind us. We're doing maybe 40 miles an hour, and this thing is coming way faster. And Ginny, accordingly, hearing this, in the room that this narrow lane allows, she pulls over to the left a little to give the motorcycle room to pass. It is evidently coming at least twice our speed and possibly more. And we drive along like that for a while. The sound of the motorcycle is behind us, and I even looked over my shoulder to see whether I could see the motorcycle. I thought, that's somebody absolutely ripping along on a Harley, because it was very definitely the sound of a big V-twin. And I recognise the sound of a big V-twin when I hear one. Heaven knows, I've been around motorcycles and two-wheeled vehicles all my adult life, so I know a V-twin when I hear one. And that's what this was. Absolutely not a shadow of doubt in my mind. And it was tearing along. I looked back over my shoulder, and there was absolutely nothing there. But the noise was there, as if we were being followed at about 20-30 yards distance behind by a very large V-twin motorcycle. And we drove along, and slowly, after about a minute or so of this, the sound just faded away, just tailed off into nothing. And I did not know what to make of this. So I turned to Ginny and I said, "Did you hear that?" And she said, "Yes, I did. Did you see me pull over to the side?" I said, "Yes, I noticed. You pulled over to leave room for him to pass." And she said, "It must be that there's a road that runs parallel to this. Have a look at the map." And this is in the days, but this is 1997, before sat-navs and GPS were commonplace. And we were navigating by a map that was laid out on my lap. So I had a look at the map. No roads for miles around, certainly nothing running parallel. We were on an isolated country road running through the middle of nowhere. And I explained this to Ginny, and that was it. We were baffled, mystified, but eventually I had to come to the conclusion that this was Lawrence visiting us. Heaven knows we had meddled with his spirit enough that day. We had been to the man's home and been to his final resting place, and I had all but been talking to him in my mind. And when it came right down to it, there was nothing frightening or scary about this. It was like a salute. It was an acknowledgement that people were still interested in him, and that he enjoyed that, and that he was still the same brash, brave spirit as ever he was. And that is the one fully authenticated time that I can say that I truly met a ghost, and it was my privilege so to do.